In this lecture, we're interested in looking at Joan of Arc's strange position as a warrior. She was the opposite of nearly every traditional medieval military stereotype. A virgin, peasant girl without a shred of military experience. Yet something about her, some kind of charisma or madness, inspired the Dauphin Charles and other great nobles to let her have a major share in commanding the war effort, and inspired the common soldiers and the civilian common people to believe in her unlikely promises. The completeness and swiftness of her victory in raising the siege of Orleans must have seemed like some kind of miracle to her contemporaries. What convinced Charles to make Joan a captain of arms and send her against the English besieging Orleans? The rank the Dauphin accorded her was indicated by her own personal banner and a fine suit of plate armor, both of which were made for her at top speed. She had her own contingent of troops and an accredited herald, just like the top-level noble commanders. More importantly, she had the right to coordinate on an equal basis with the French commander defending Orleans. Most of Charles's counselors at court seems to have been dead set against these striking concessions. To check his own instincts, however, the Dauphin, before he sent Joan off to war, sent her down to Poitiers to be examined by a court of university professors and other high clerics. What's amazing is that after the long investigation they did of her and the proof that she was required to give of her virginity, they cleared her. Her orthodoxy was attested, her virginity affirmed, and her mission approved. This was Joan's first trial. Unfortunately, the transcript, the famous Poitiers transcript, has been lost, perhaps with the collusion of the Archbishop of Reims, who never liked Joan. Remember that France was riven between Anglo-Burgundian alliances in the so-called French, the Armagnacs, supporters of the Valois dynasty. Joan was not interested in the Armagnac faction as such, or in any factions. She saw the matter simply: drive the English out of France. And she saw her mission as the restoration of French national identity and dignity. By the time she left for Orleans in April, the third week of April of 1429, La Pucelle seemed to embody Christian nationalism with her banner, her armor, and her full-fledged military and diplomatic household. She had also remarkably acquired a holy sword, for which Charles sent to Saint Catherine de Fierbois, a shrine to the Frankish hero Charles Martel's victory against the Saracens 7 centuries before. Let's listen to her say how she knew about it. When asked at her trial how, in early March of 1429, between the time that she was validated by her Dauphin and before she began her march to Orleans, Joan asked for a sword and sent a man, an unnamed armorer of Tours, to collect a sword that she said would be found buried below or behind the altar of the church of St. Catherine of Fierbois. The sword was located immediately and brought to her swiftly. Almost exactly 2 years later, in February of 1431, the judges at her condemnation trial asked her how she knew there was a sword to be found buried in the earth, and she said, "That sword was in the earth, rusted, bearing 5 engraved crosses. I knew that that sword was there by my voices. I had never before seen the man who went to look for that sword, and I wrote to the men of the church of that place, asking if it might please them that I might have that sword, and they sent it to me. That sword was not deeply buried in the earth, and the men of the church, rubbing it on the spot, made the rust fall off." How extraordinary. Especially to think that this peasant girl without military training would understand the significance of such a sword. Swords identify, authorize, and authenticate medieval warriors in fact and in legend. Think of Roland's sword, Durendal. Think of King Arthur's sword, Excalibur. Like the King Arthur and the Cid of legends, Joan of Arc had several swords, each one of which marked a particular part of her identity. First, she had been given a gift sword by her sponsor, Robert de Baudricourt, before she left to go see the Dauphin in Chinon. And she received that when she was on the road to Chinon to meet her Dauphin. That was her craft sword, we might call it, identifying her as a warrior by profession. Later, she took a good sword of war made for giving and taking blows, she said, as a prize from her Burgundian. And she may have had even one more war sword. Those are her prowess swords, identifying her as a champion heroine. But for her contemporaries, as for us, the sword from St. Catherine de Fierbois must have had special resonance, since it so neatly yokes Joan's spirituality and her bellicosity. Fierbois itself replicates that yoking of war and religion in another famous sword. When she passed through Fierbois on her final stage of the journey to Chinon, Joan may well have heard the extraordinary story of Charles Martel's sword, which he left there in the chapel of St. Catherine to commemorate his victory over the Saracens in autumn of 732. Is it more than happy coincidence that swords of these two famous champions, each of whom exercised profound claims on the French imagination as saviors of their country's core identity and ideologies, were allegedly housed in one country chapel? This is no cathedral. This is a little country chapel, the chapel of St. Catherine of Fierbois. We don't know. But it's interesting that later legend identifies Joan's sword as that of Charles Martel's, that great Carolingian war chief, which was buried beneath the altar so that it would be found in time of need by another liberator of the French people. The sword of St. Catherine of Fierbois authenticates and authorizes Joan's mission. The people of Fierbois, according to Joan and the trial witnesses later, validated Joan's mission when they sent her not only the sword, but a precious sheath to hold it. For their part, they say, the men of the Church of St. Catherine de Fierbois gave her a sheath, as did the people of Tours. She had therefore two sheaths, one of vermeil velvet and the other of cloth of gold. And she herself had another made in heavy leather, very strong. Joan's basic disposition we see there. The gifts that she's given by the people of Fierbois and those of Tours are not sufficient for her, glamorous, pretty, gorgeous as they may have been. It's the strong leather that she chooses for herself. And look at that strength and simplicity also in the kind of language that she uses. That sword in the earth, rusted, bearing 5 engraved crosses. I knew that the sword was there by my voices. For her, saintly voices led her to a material sword, as cause leads to effect. For her, it was logical, practical, and for us, unassailable. The trial judges, when she was put on trial for her life later, continuously poked into Joan's body, her clothing, and her possessions. They investigated and re-investigated her body to see if a non-virgin and therefore a heretic and a liar could be found lurking there. They are endlessly curious about her stuff, about her personal war equipment, especially the design for her standard and her banner, whose symbolism the judges find potentially subversive since they involve Jesus and Mary. The judges require full details about her suits of armor, and of course no subject fascinates or repels them, these men wearing dresses, more than her choice of wardrobe and of her cross-dressing as a man. The trial records show the interrogation spiraling around these matters of Joan's body and her clothing, obsessively returning to these matters in attempts to locate or demonstrate Joan's deviance. It's therefore really remarkable that when they ask her about the sword, they ask her about it only once and never pursue the story again. Why do they not look more deeply into the potential sacrilege of her disturbing church ground, the sacred space of the church and the altar of St. Catherine de Fierbois? Why don't they argue that only witchcraft could have caused the sword's encrusted rust to fall off with one mere rubbing? Why don't they inquire more deeply into the sword's current whereabouts? Why don't they probe more deeply into its connections to Fierbois, to the gift sword of Charles Martel? The answer, I think, to all of these questions is clear. No judge intent on condemning Joan could gain anything from that exchange. The judges plot a line of questioning from the rituals of the fairy tree in Domremy, where you were a witch as a child, to the voices of the sword, and then to the standard. Clearly, they were trying to provoke Joan into some admission or slip that would indicate witchcraft practices. Instead, Joan stated simply that she knew of this sword's existence only from her voices. Since Joan's judges, churchmen that they were, shared with Joan a belief that heavenly saints could transgress worldly boundaries, they could not, in theory, deny the possibility that Joan's voices were those of God's saints. Furthermore, the judges could not suggest that the sword itself was polluted without suggesting that it had polluted the orthodoxy of the very church, the church in which it was found. Joan says, when asked further about the sword, the king wished to give her a fine sword, and she asked that it might please him to send for the one that could be found at St. Catherine de Fierbois, whereby the king marveled mightily and asked her if she had ever seen it, to which she answered no, but nonetheless she knew from her voices that it was there. The king sent there. That sword was found along with others that had been given in time past, and it was brought to the king, who had it honorably dressed and furnished for her. Had Joan's trial judges pursued their original queries about the sword, they might well have provoked an enhanced association dangerous to their own cause. If they pressed her any harder on the point, they ran the risk of converting that sword into a sign far more potent than its physical self, from being a blade into a sign not just of antiquarian interest, but into a talisman of the delivery of Christian France, a relic of Charles Martel or of the 100 Years' War, an object like the Holy Grail, with mystic as well as historical associations. Readers of what Joan said about her sword at her trial are always impressed by the flat factuality with which she speaks of her sword. She's so accustomed to receiving information through her voices. She's just as she is accustomed, seemingly, to bearing arms. She therefore shows no surprise about the discovery of the sword. It was where it ought to have been. So unlike the surprise that we see in the legends of King Arthur when the sword in the stone appears, that becomes the great sign of Arthur's kingship that he's able to pull out of the stone, we find with Joan someone who asks that they dig under the earth beneath an altar for a sword she knows will be there. It is. The rest of the world is surprised, but never Joan. The connection of that sword for her to St. Catherine, one of her voices, brings that sword for her together with the promise of everlasting futures. In the face of that innocent serenity, clear and calm knowledge, Joan's judges fall silent. That is one little story about scenes and moments in Joan's life that we can't find ourselves entirely understanding. But it happened when she was getting ready to set out for Orléans and complete her mission. The strategic importance of Orléans, as I said earlier, is great. It lay close to the center of the kingdom, of which the English, the Burgundians, controlled most of the northern provinces. So Orléans was key to the southern half of the kingdom. Not far to the south of Orléans lay the city of Bourges, which had become the French capital since Henry V of England had conquered Paris, which enjoyed being the capital of Plantagenet France. The English began a serious and very expensive siege of Orleans in October of 1428. No one had any illusions about how important it was for the French to keep it or for the English to get it. It was the key to everything that would follow. But why did the troops follow Joan, La Pucelle? The French forces defending Orleans were demoralized. So was its population of about 30,000 people, a very large urban population for the time. And remember, here we have the French forces, all of whom are on the inside. It's the English who are on the outside besieging them, and they are about to fall. The city is about to fall to the English. The experienced captains of arms there for the French side were commanded by Joan, the bastard of Orleans, later known as the Count of Dunois. The bastard, it was perfectly polite to refer to bastards in those days, the bastard, as he was generally addressed, was then acting head of the House of Orleans. Why? Because his half-brother Charles, the legitimate Duke of Orleans, was languishing in long, elegant captivity in England, where he had been visiting since being captured at Agincourt in 1415. He was still awaiting the completion of his ransom so that he could go home. We can see, in other words, how much the protocols of chivalric warfare still pertained to those who survived Agincourt. While there in England, of course, we know that the Duke of Orleans wrote some important poetry in English as well as in French. But none of these experienced warriors, the bastard, the Dunois, were inclined to take the advice, however well-intentioned, never mind the orders of this inexperienced peasant girl who just seemed to be some new plaything of their Dauphin. Joan's strategy was unremitting attack on English positions, no matter how invincible they seemed. The seasoned commanders were aghast at her recklessness, aghast because it went against all the protocols of war as they knew it. But the rank-and-file soldiers and the besieged populace seemed to agree with her. Several times, Joan issued orders to attack in direct confrontation, and yet her direct confrontation and attack plans were turned back by the bastard and his staff. Somehow, in spite of the fact that the bastard wouldn't do anything she asked to have done, he nevertheless claimed to admire her even before the battle was joined. Although they sustained very great losses, however, the French troops, who were also supported by the townspeople who were on the city walls, stormed the strongest of the 7 fortresses with which the English had surrounded the city. After that, the English army abandoned the siege, and on May 8th, marched north. The townsfolk organized a vibrant Thanksgiving procession, of which Joan was the ecstatically praised heroine. So, having been able to break through the resistance first of her own other commanders and bring with her the desire of the common soldier, marching frontally against the English, Joan was able to save the city. She was a very curious kind of military commander. Although she carried a sword in battle, she never killed a man. It was later alleged that she had struck some female camp followers on the back with her sword to drive them away from her morally purified army. What did she demand of the men who were going with her in order to lift the siege of Orleans? The soldiers were required to go to Mass and confession daily, and they were forbidden to curse, and so on. This was no ordinary pack of soldiers by the time she was finished with them. In touching ways, Joan seemed never really to have become accustomed to the sight of dying men, whether they were on the English or on the French side. She would try to comfort those she found dying. Joan lacked any kind of military training, yet her military impulses and instincts seemed impeccable, at least until they later failed in that terrible failed attack on Paris in August of 1429. But who could have given her military training? Was it St. Michael, the military archangel, whom she claimed was one of her voices? Some of her companions in arms seem to have thought so. Or was it simply raw talent and sheer courage? It was universally assumed that military talent, as well as the right and the capacity to command, were inherited with noble blood. Yet Joan was a peasant through and through. Although she rode war horses very well, like a man born to that skill, remember the royal bastard theory had yet to be invented, though it would call attention to that fact, how could she have won the respect and occasionally the obedience of such great nobles as the bastard of Orleans, as Duke John of Alençon, who may have had a kind of crush on her, as the supremely self-confident Gilles de Rais, the foul-tongued sergeant, later known as the child molester and murderer Bluebeard, who was a Breton ultra-aristocrat and one of the richest men in Europe who simply adored her? How was she able to win their support? Let's think about that. It was assumed that any woman traveling with soldiers was a prostitute. Jacques d'Arc, as we know, had been so afraid of this that he told his sons to drown Joan should she follow the army, as he dreamt she might do. Yet here was the French army following Joan the Virgin. How could she exert such persuasive power over common soldiers as well as over noble captains? To answer that, one might have to believe in miracles, or to recognize how powerful it was when Joan said to those whom she was leading, not that she was worried about whether if they performed this particular release of the army, they'd be able to achieve that military aim, not that she was worried about a complicated war strategy, or whether she thought in order to get up front you needed to go around back. Joan was full of great simplicity. If she saw an object, she wanted to get there by the most direct route. Simplicity and clarity were exactly what her culture at that point lacked. Let us go back once more to the question of the enormous complexity of the 100 Years' War and the enormous difficulty that was there because of the great schism and the popes. One had everywhere questions that were so complex that it was hard to figure out answers. And the terrible, threatening burden of the war was awful to the English and to the French, who were the victims. Both the English people, with the kinds of taxes they had to pay and the number of the amount of military personnel they had to provide, and the French, because on their land they watched their crops being sacrificed, their herds being taken, their women being raped. Over and over, we have village after village being slaughtered. And what was the fear of those inside Orleans, who themselves were starving because they had been holding out against the English troops? Their fear is that they would all be decimated. There was nothing left for them to hope in. All this time, the forces of Charles had been getting weaker and weaker. Since the Battle of Agincourt, the pressure and all of the power was on the side of the English. They were able to invade and move with great freedom, only occasionally being stopped by some kind of assassination or other hazard. But the great war leaders we saw in earlier France were now hard to find. Captain after captain, duke after duke fell to the side of the English. And we had the holdouts in the south of France, those Armagnacs who believed so much in the power of their land, as Eleanor of Aquitaine had believed in hers earlier. So when we see the great simplicity of Joan coming to face these enormously tortured, difficult questions, who is my king, does seem like a simple question. There was no problem in those days of dimpled chads. One had there not a vote for a king, but the election of a king by virtue of birth and noble blood. And yet that noble blood was unable to rouse the forces of the people and the nobility to such a peak that it would be able to produce the powerful result of liberating Orleans or of crowning Charles. It may also be true that Joan was the first popular figure who gave voice to the French form of nationalism that persisted into the Revolution. It may be true that it was to Joan as much as to any other person that we can trace the origin of the popular meaning of the term, the king is France, that the king is the land. For Joan, the need to make Charles king was identical to a need to save the country. For Joan, she saw that whole male line and male lineage of authority with absolute simplicity as a requirement for high kingship. I think if we think about the formation and myth of the origins of nations, that we can see the importance of Joan in forging a popular view of what a nation is. I urge all of you to look at a brilliant new book by Patrick Geary called The Myth of Nations, which talks about the way that kings become identified with the land. Finally, it's also true, I think, when we ask how Joan came to lead soldiers, that there are two other things that must be taken into account. The military historian Kelly DeVries has argued with great persuasiveness that the greatest of Joan's simplifying tasks when she became a military commander was to say to all the men of France, God has chosen me, and if you fight with me, we will win. And if you die as you fight with me, you will go to heaven. Many kings and many dukes had promised them many little rewards, but Joan of Arc promised them something permanent. Whatever they did had rich and final meaning if they fought on her side, if they fought with her for the sake of something greater than she. So they could see her interested not in gaining wealth for herself, not in trying to accumulate honors and position, but rather as someone who thought what she was doing was fundamental, simple, and absolutely right. Something so right that it swept them along in a sense of its righteousness. And that leads me to the second point. They understood, therefore, that their Joan was chosen by God. I think it's also true, and I think military historians even have underestimated this, that soldiers only want to follow someone who has absolute confidence in their mission, confidence, and that they prefer to follow into battle someone who in battle becomes the heat of battle. What later is called cold strategy and is studied in military academies is often, when it happens, thought to be menacing madness, boiling blood. Like the ancient hero Achilles when he rejoins the battle at Troy after the death of Patroclus. When he is enraged so that his blood is boiling, he will not eat because his rage is so well forged towards the goal of killing those who killed his beloved Patroclus. Like that ancient hero Achilles, Joan was a berserker in battle. She was a holy berserker who used the edge of her tongue and the point of her exposed and mystic sword to rally her troops with great clarity about their mission, which was to bring the king to the throne, and clarity about an even greater mission, to bring France off its knees, to bring themselves to the goal of heaven, and to bring to all of them this terrifying and seemingly impossible victory. And she did.